Hey folks, I'm Allison. Welcome to my booktube channel. This video came about sort of accidentally. I saw a video on another YouTuber's channel, Robert G. Reader of Books, and that video was titled Reading Books About Books tag. And I clicked on it thinking, what a cool tag. I'm really interested to know what his thoughts are about books, and he is reading books about books. He does have videos about reading books about books, but it just happened to be that that tag video is not specifically focused on books about books. And by the time I realized that, I was already sort of off to the races thinking about what are my favorite books about books. So you're getting this video because of that misunderstanding. But I'm still really excited to share with you some of my favorite books about books. I have 3 books on the list, and I tried to think of sort of a variety of different kinds of ways that a book can be about books. The first one is the most obvious, and that is Mary Oliver's A Poetry Handbook. Mary Oliver is one of my absolute favorite poets. I mean, I think she's one of everyone's absolute favorite poets. She's amazing. You've definitely heard her poems, even if you didn't know that that's what you were hearing. I was literally in a yoga class the other day, and the end of class meditation that the instructor read was a Mary Oliver poem, and I was laying there thinking oh, okay, everybody loves Mary Oliver. So she's brilliant. She really knows what she's talking about. And this little handbook is such a unique insight into what she thinks about when she writes a poem, and how knowing the craft that goes into it can really help you appreciate when you're reading the poem. Just to give you an example of the kind of thing she talks about that is so cool to me. There's a chapter on the sounds in poems, and she gives this excerpt by Robert Frost stopping by woods on a snowy evening. The point she's making here is the way that he repeats the same sounds throughout the words to give a particular sense to the poem. And so the vibe that this poem has is that it's quiet, introspective. The speaker is in a dark and solitary woods with falling snow. And so the sounds that you hear in the poem, there's a lot of W sounds and dark sounds, and several sets of O sounds, very, very dark, sort of almost spooky kinds of consonant sounds littered throughout the poem. And that by having words with those consonant sounds in them, he really creates the vibe of being in the woods on this snowy evening. So the first stanza is, "Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow." And so, having had pointed out to me that this stanza is full of it's so obvious. It jumps off the page the way that he's, whose woods these are, the village, watch his woods fill up with snow. You can really hear the way that he's creating atmosphere through these sounds. But, if I didn't have somebody to point that out to me, like a genius like Mary Oliver, it would totally not have been something that ever occurred to me as part of the way that Robert Frost is crafting the vibe of the poem. So anyways, this book is full of really cool insights that have totally changed the way that I read and appreciate poetry, and particularly the brilliance of really great poets. The second book that I picked is Old School by Tobias Wolff. This is a novel, so shifting gears from, nonfiction literally telling you how to read books, to a novel that is about a teenage boy in a boarding school, in a sort of specialized boarding school program where he is learning to be a writer and is getting to meet a bunch of famous writers and learn about the craft of writing. And throughout the protagonist's experience, you, the reader, also are engaged in this conversation about, how to write, basically what is great literature, and, what are great writers doing, and that sort of thing. And it's a really lovely book. It's a fun book, because it has this sort of posh, dark academia vibe to it, which is fun, but in a way that I think really has a good soul to it. You know, it isn't dark academia in a sort of totally lofty, disconnected from reality way. The author is in some ways grappling with privilege, even as he's living this quite privileged life. And one of the ways that he is grappling with it is through his experience reading books, because obviously one of the great things about books is that they take you outside of your experience and, you know, can teach you empathy and context and all sorts of wonderful things like that. And I thought I would read just a quick passage of this book as well that I think really encapsulates what is so lovely about it. So in this passage, the protagonist is assigned to read The Fountainhead by Ayn Rand, and then she comes as a speaker to the class. And she gets into sort of a fight almost with one of the professors at the school who had fought in World War II over whether Jack Barnes from The Sun Also Rises, which is a famous Hemingway novel, whether he had been acting heroically or, you know, whether the sort of self-sacrifice that resulted in his injury, which is one of the driving features of The Sun Also Rises, whether that was weakness. Because from Ayn Rand's perspective, that sort of self-sacrifice that you didn't have to do that resulted in a serious injury that then caused him to be impotent was a form of weakness. And so this is the protagonist's take basically on what he learned about reading Ayn Rand from reading Hemingway. You can't read Indian Camp and then go back to The Fountainhead. Everything seems bloated and cheesy. The swollen sentences, the hysterical partisanship of the author, the crassly symbolic, uninflected characters, the impossible things they think and say and do. Really, you can't believe a word of it. Indian Camp ruined The Fountainhead for me, even as the novel helped me to see the patience and delicacy and adamant reality of the story. So I think that's a perfect excerpt that really encapsulates the way that this book, as you're reading it and following along with the protagonist's experiences, also really has a lot to say about how to read books, you know, and how about what is good writing and what makes a good novel. And I find that this is one of the books where it has this great sort of in the weeds philosophical discussion, but littered throughout what is quite an enjoyable read of a novel. The last book on my list is The Fountainhead by Doris Lessing. This one is maybe obvious. This is my favorite book. I've talked about it in other videos. If I was going to do a video about books about reading books or books about writing books, this was definitely going to be on the list. This is a book about an author with writer's block and the various notebooks that she keeps that parcel out the different versions of her life and keep them separate as she is attempting to write what she thinks of as 4 different novels. And this is a really lovely book. It has some problematic bits. It's like old, so I always like to flag that. The sort of like feminism is quite outdated and there's a bit of like homophobia, but it is nevertheless an absolutely beautiful, beautiful book. And it has such interesting things to say about narrative in particular and storytelling that I think really impact the way that I read stories. It has this really interesting sort of Heidegger thing going on where it, you know, is investigating the way that stories have beginnings and ends. And the end of a story impacts the way that you interpret the beginning of the story. But then once you've reinterpreted the beginning of the story, that then changes your interpretation of the sort of whole of the story. And so the way that we understand events situated within narratives, there isn't really like an ability to do it in a fixed way, because every time you sort of come to a greater understanding of the whole or the end, that changes your understanding of the individual pieces of a story and particularly of the beginning of the story. And I think that is so interesting. I am a big rereader of books. The books that I really love are books that hold up on, 5, 10, 20 rereads. And I think being able to have this perspective of the significance of events in a narrative changes over the course of coming to understand the way that those events fit into the narrative And I think, that is true of life, obviously, but I think it is also such an interesting perspective to have in mind when reading books. It's always really interesting to me when I read a book to try to think about whether the author knew where the plot was going when they started the book, or whether they had to sort of like knit things up at the end. And I think the perspective that I got reading this book about just the way that storytelling itself functions has been such, an interesting insight as a person living life through the lens of narrative, obviously, as a human being, but also has been a really interesting perspective as a, reader of stories. So there you have it. These are 3 books about reading books that I would recommend to anyone who is curious to learn more about the process and experience of creating narrative and interpreting narrative. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you'd like to hear more from me, please consider subscribing. And as always, thank you so much for spending some of your one wild and precious life with me watching this video. Goodbye.